Hey, well, Jim, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to introduce Jim because this is a really exciting partnership, and we're really excited about that session, which is why we're featuring it this morning. Jim is with NACUBO, and for those of you who don't know, that's the National Association of College and University Business Officers. The reason we're so excited about this partnership is that while Ad Astra has been working in a space that's very significant, has very significant financial implications. Admittedly, we haven't really figured out how to have a very productive or deep dialogue with chief business officers or NACUBO as an organization, other than just going to a few conferences. And so this partnership with NACUBO Consulting, we look at that as kind of a bridge. And I'm guessing that many of you attending today will feel the same way on the academic side of the house, or maybe working in the registrar's office or in IT, that you don't directly interact with the business office. But this is a session that can show how all of us can productively partner with the chief business officer in working together to create financial sustainability. So thanks for joining, Jim.
Great. Good morning to everyone. And Tom, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So just kind of jumping right in, this is a framework that we've talked about a lot and that we have on our website that really applies here too. And Jim's going to be talking a lot about the discover side and the design side, really in the kind of broader financial planning framework that they do at NACUBO Consulting. And then we're going to be mainly focusing on some of the deliver pieces kind of down a little bit further in the weeds about how we can actually have the academic side of the institution contribute to financial health. So Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about this slide and maybe how the partnership might feel at an institution?
Sure. At NACUBO, we know that business officers are concerned about the business model. They're concerned about financial sustainability, and they're really asking us to be more solution oriented. So we've spent a lot of time in theory. We spent a lot of time in trying to think about the big picture and its implications. But we're really beginning now to think more about where are the changes that we need to make operationally. What are the types of models or budget forecasts that need to be done far more carefully than they probably had been in the past. We at higher ed have been awfully additive in our world, and we know that we need to start subtracting as well. And certainly many institutions are doing that, but we continue to think that that will be more of a theme and more of a necessity. No one's desiring it, but it's certainly a necessity. And how do you begin to think about creative partnerships that will grow or diversify your revenue? How will you think about creative partnerships that will potentially reduce costs? And how do you think of then about doing that in a way that really is moving towards a supportive environment where we're out there trying to help CFOs and others be successful in their roles, and so looking to develop strategy to help institutions really move forward. And that, of course, is what many institutions are looking for today.
Absolutely. And that's especially relevant today with all the disruption with the pandemic, Jim.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we've got all the pandemic stuff going on. And if you didn't see just last week, there was in the Chronicle and in Inside Higher Ed, literally thousands of jobs that have now been lost just in higher education alone. I think it was 42,000. One report said, another said 60,000 plus positions that have been lost. So that's going on in addition to the things we have up on the slide, which is the demographic shifts that we're seeing. And in particular, I think two things that are, hitting us right now are urban centers were growing in great popularity. And now with COVID, things are, people are taking a step back. Do they want to live in that urban environment? And of course, all the data is showing, how down we are at international students and how vulnerable we potentially are to that population. Net tuition revenues continue to be a struggle for both public and private institutions. While there's certainly a lot more in the media about the private discounting rate, we know, and polling from IPED's data, we have found and see more public institutions discounting more, so revenue is down. And that comes at a time when Generation Z is reporting, unbelievably, overconnected and overwhelmed. But again, just last week, seeing an article that talked about how much demand is up in counseling centers and other health
Right.
support agencies on campus. So it's a struggling time for sure.
Yeah, and what we've also seen in this kind of this seemingly increasingly kind of frantic effort to identify new revenue streams, we've seen institutions offer a whole new variety of degrees and kind of ways of pursuing those degrees. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. We despite everybody wanting or wishing for more traditional age students, every piece of data suggests that that is not going to happen. We will have that 3-ish million number of students, but that's going to remain relatively flat. We know the affordability issue is going to increase. And so, we've developed this, little mini model. Lumina has done a ton of work on this about really thinking about how much, students may really stop at an associate's degree. Then they may look for some specific credentialing. Then they're going to start their careers. Then they're going to come back for some things, get a certificate, maybe do a really in-depth apprenticeship. Then that will move on to another certificate. They may do all of that before they get a bachelor's degree. And so our model is about to change. And so how do we think about those efficiencies that we need to be putting into place so that more students are completing in a faster amount of time that also embeds in a flexible infrastructure?
Right, because that makes it affordable for the student and for the institution. Excellency in Higher Education has come up with this framework that we're going to be talking about today as well, called the post-traditional student, which I think very much overlaps with the concepts that you're sharing here on this slide.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, from a strategic financial perspective, we have tried to frame into, asking, is an institution ready? And we are still finding institutions that are not ready to really take on the tough challenges. And because of that, that is where we're just seeing the, death by 1,000 cuts. And maybe shouldn't use the word death because that's jarring to people, but certainly it is feeling very painful on the campus. And so as you think about your mission, as you think about your structures, as you think about your resources, how are you coming up with better solutions? And we do believe that, restructuring is going to become the norm. A leaner organizational structure is going to occur with reduced administrative units. And so, we went through the 90s and 2010s in just this massive growth effort because our enrollments were growing. We have not really taken the time now to consolidate or bring things into a more efficient operating model. I mean, some institutions certainly have, and I know many of you are, but technology has advanced so dramatically in the last 10 years, and yet we still find most institutions not using the technology tools that they need to help streamline processes, streamline ways that we'll talk about in a minute too, Tom, but the things that we need to do. And you also have to be investing. You have to be investing in areas that are growth and that are lean into your strengths. Marketing and recruitment is going to be continually need more investment. And certainly we know that there's a push coming from the federal government, regardless of party, around equity, success, and completion. So, so that is a place where, the question of, only 40% of students graduating from your institution is no longer going to be acceptable. And we do think there is the potential for funding to be reduced based on your completion, but also needing to understand students and where they're at.
Yes. And obviously where we focus there is on student progress and what we call degree velocity. So this really is a key thing here, and it gets to essentially the academic strategy of an institution where every institution has a unique set of offerings that they're known for, that they have strength in. Can you talk a little bit about this and kind of
Sure. Yeah,
that portfolio?
Yeah, we really think you need to be thinking much more about a portfolio. So for those of you who have a retirement plan, you know that you diversify your assets into a variety of ways to yield for you a larger return or a stronger return on your investment, right? Same concept here. How are you really considering what programs you're offering, the feasibility of those offerings, the realities of implementing, and your talents and resources? And so many institutions are adding new programs that require completely new staff or faculty to come in to teach the program. That really grows in expense. Now, some of them, there's a huge market demand and need. You absolutely should be doing that to round out for your portfolios. New things are being invented all the time. But yet there are other times where we see institutions really not leaning into their strengths and they're not challenging their assumptions. So the easiest example I have is most institutions have a flagship program or two programs or three programs that they're known for. My last institution, there was a program that we were literally internationally known for. And when I said, why isn't that program online? Why aren't we offering that in a diversified program? Everyone said, oh, that's not the design of that program. But yet we were literally internationally known for it, had people from around the globe come to that program, but you had to come, be in person, only do it face to face. When I would push back, they're like, well, they just don't want to do that. I'm like, well, right, but we can't do that anymore. Like, that's where we've got to really be thinking about this portfolio and then challenging those assumptions to say, hey, this is our strength. We need to lean into that strength in order to continue to grow.
And the alternative is really enrollment chasing, that almost becomes me too as a strategy, right? So the institution down the road is offering a credential in X, and we've heard about that, so we better do it as well, which is kind of the antithesis of what you're describing.
Absolutely. And you've got to be much more keenly aware. There are only so many students for many of the programs, and there's also only so many jobs. And of course, students and families are asking much more about jobs. And so, unless you're going to do something that is really distinctive, and, what we hear often, it is not really as distinctive as people are looking for to make that happen.
Right. And NACUBO Consulting specifically, not only do we feel like you guys can create a really great bridge to the things that we and the people that we work with kind of focus on, and the chief financial officer, but also you guys have figured out a way to have pretty contained, financially accessible kind of engagements where you're doing a lot of really interesting things. Can you talk about that and kind of your approach here?
Sure. We find that there are always 5, 8, 10, 12 programs on an institution, sometimes more depending on your size. If you're a mega, certainly there are more, but that are making some really strong net revenue. That when you look at it, that you're making money, and that money goes to support other programs and other operational costs. So this isn't necessarily a game about just giving the shiniest bubbles more resources. This is about really using data to understand what are those programs that are building up net revenue and have higher net revenue that align with programs, interest, the things that are out there that students are asking for. So we've got this strong program, it's producing a lot of net revenue, it's got strong market demand, and that we're really focusing on net revenue versus headcount. So for some programs, if we just grew a program by 25 students, the net revenue there is significant. And if we grew another program by 75 students, we might still have the same net revenue. Well, those 75 students require a whole lot more support services, other things. Now, if you have empty residence hall beds and other things where you're needing to fill up your campus, that might be a great opportunity for you. So we're really trying to take that approach that looks holistically at the institutions, its revenue opportunities, and where to grow, and also thinking about new ways to partner together. We are living in more and more of an interdisciplinary construct. And so how do you bring programs together in new interdisciplinary ways that will also lead to higher net revenue and or lower new costs for the institution to make those budget models and projections that is really all focused on ROI. So when we're doing this stuff, we are always looking at the return on that investment.
Yeah, and obviously some credentials have to be offered as a service to the region and the mission, and maybe need to be subsidized, but don't need to be subsidized maybe as much as they're currently being subsidized. And you have to pick your kind of your shots there, right? You need to be really
Correct.
selective about
Absolutely.
it. My
Absolutely.
dad used to tell a joke about his architectural firm. He used to say that we lose money on every deal, but we make up for it with volume. And you
Yeah,
definitely don't want to take that approach in higher
right,
education.
right. But we've tried. We've
Yeah,
tried.
we certainly do try, don't we? So
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about kind of this framework of
Yeah.
embracing optimum enrollment?
Yeah, sure. And we'll conclude with that and get into some of your slides too, Tom. Institutions have been probably spending too much time reaching for things all over the map. And we
Right.
do think that it is time now that you've got to become more focused. And so while we certainly appreciate the desire to be this multifaceted concept. If I look at a few of these as examples, like, if you've been really firmly grounded in your region and within 250 miles is where most of your students from, yes, it's important to build out and think about tertiary markets and where you're going to grow. It is also important to really stay focused in your prime area. And we're seeing lots of dollars being spent to do things that the data suggests strongly students are going to do.
Yes.
You think about the academic profile. Everybody seems to want better students for the most part. Not everybody. Many institutions do.
Sure.
The reality is the data tells us something totally different. There are so many great 2.75 to 3.2 students out there that
Right.
are ready, that are eager, that are hungry, and yet we often dismiss them out as not being strong enough or not raising our academic profile. So, I know and understand that the rankings game and things is very important to many boards and to many presidents and leaders, but yet the reality is that we've got a much more diversified student profile coming in, a much more diversified student that is looking for different course offerings, different opportunities, and programs that do have capacity issues. So you've got to really be thinking about, if these 7 programs really have a max capacity because of their laboratory space or the other things they have to do off campus,
Right.
You've got to put that into place. You've got to consider that a real issue as you're looking at that portfolio, and then what programs and courses are you going to offer? What new programs can you create? So it really is, again, linking to that portfolio concept. This is then the layer on top of that to say, and where are we going to focus our efforts and activities that are realistic?
Yeah, and I think that's a great trade-off to maybe talk about in the discussion as well, is this whole notion of, am I going to optimize to become like my aspirational peers, or am I going to optimize to serve in my existing slot that we're in, and kind of live out our mission as our demographics kind of dictate, right?
And be really great at it and be really proud of it. When I was when I was the VP for enrollment and student affairs at Plymouth State, we really owned that we were an institution that really focused on getting students ready for their careers right out of college, and
right.
that really resonated with a ton of students and families. And because of that, we saw great gains and results for that because we embraced who we are. And not everyone loved that, but most of us loved it. And so that was where we leaned into with great success.
Yeah, that's a great example. Well, so transitioning a little bit about how these pieces kind of fit together, we've already talked a little bit this morning in the sessions about this framework that we call the academic enterprise, and managing the academic enterprise and all the different components. And kind of clearly for us, you've already alluded to the 2 big outcomes of doing it effectively, and that's really student success and financial health. And we're going to be talking, not surprisingly, in this session, more about financial health and how, kind of in a more detailed way, we can partner with your folks at NACUBO Consulting to provide clarity into financial health and measuring and managing that health. So, the big ideas here, Jim, as we've discussed, are, you've kind of already touched on these, that financial health is an important thing for us to deal with. We have to confront it, especially now, when Moody's annually, or I think annually, they come out with the updated ratings bond ratings on higher education as a sector. And they said something really shocking in one of the articles, that there are still some institutions in a bad financial situation that instead of making changes, were kind of in effect camping out just north of Armageddon. And obviously what your group is doing is mobilizing the chief financial officer and his team to be more proactive versus kind of camping out just north of Armageddon. And obviously these are some of the things that you've already talked about. Schools are becoming more tuition dependent. Over half of the operating costs, we've known this for years, are allocated through the academic schedule. Few institutions can subsidize multiple majors. We've already kind of talked about that. And then there becomes this fragmentation that can be the result of enrollment chasing, or even the result of a really noble aim to try to meet diverse student needs. But you've got to figure out where your critical mass of need is, because you can't be all things to all people and create a whole bunch of custom schedules for everybody.
Absolutely. Well, and as institutions have taken on more debt, there also is a reality of how many more specialized laboratory spaces can we make, how many, so there's another piece to that. When you mentioned the Moody stuff, some of their biggest concern is how much debt institutions now have, and public institutions have taken on an enormous amount of individual debt that used to be supported and funded by the state. And so, the layers of complication continue to grow for institutions.
Yeah, and then really adding to that, what we've noticed, and the reason we've decided to really lean into this slot is this slide, is that schools have had a really difficult time kind of getting their heads around what is financial health on the academic side of the house. Typically, revenue isn't even included in the discussion. There's cost modeling, there's obviously budgeting everywhere, but it's usually done at the academic unit. And when you're talking about recruiting and marketing, you're marketing credentials that students are going to take. And that's not how we look at things financially in the industry. And what we've talked about, you and I, is that a much more productive discussion is where you can factor in revenue. And I think significantly, which is kind of the point here on the right of the slide, is that we need to be focusing on how we allocate costs, not just to the departments, but what are the costs that it takes to actually teach an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a certificate. And the good news is we think there's a model out there that makes a lot of sense that we can help schools kind of unravel. And the other part about it, which is really exciting for us, is that it flows right out of our other solutions in our academic enterprise. So as we understand the enrollment health of a credential and how the students are behaving and what courses they're taking in what ways, we can start to kind of piece together how we can allocate revenue. So if a really popular degree is consuming 40% of the enrollments in this gen ed service course, even if that service course is taught from a different department, we think that one way of looking at financial health for that degree is that the revenues and the expenses to teach that class, 40% of those revenues and expenses ought to be allocated to that degree, because they're occupying 40% of the seats, right? So while it makes sense to talk about that the faculty is teaching those classes and do cost benchmarking, which the Delaware group has done a really great job of at the 4-year level. And right here at Johnson County Community College, the cost benchmarking group has done at the 2-year level. Being able to understand that at the credential level and kind of following the student is a more powerful way to look at it, especially when we're talking about recruiting and different programs we can offer.
Critical.
And then, we've kind of talked about how this all ultimately fits together, right? Then it becomes actionable, because if we can look at different programs, and to your point, if the chief business officer and their strategy can say, look, we have to have this much kind of gross margin or contribution margin coming out of the academic side of the house before we deal with indirect costs and all the other things that we need to do to run an institution, then, we can look at the building blocks that lead there, like the enrollment health of the various credentials. Are there sufficient enrollments, or, do we only have 20 students in this credential? And worse yet, as we've discussed, maybe half of the students are, on one campus and half the students are on another campus. And you get these really small cohorts that are hard to sustain financially. And then we've also looked at pathways and how, when you're designing your pathways and you're advising students to follow these pathways, you need to be cognizant of the enrollment health of the degree, because you can't afford to offer 8 different ways to meet a program requirement in that degree with only 20 students, right? And then that feeds right into schedule refinement, and then ultimately all of that leads to financial health. So a little bit kind of, more about this, and then we'll kind of open it up to discussion. Again, we think we can measure financial health and focus on that by really following the student instead of following the department. We're not saying you shouldn't budget at the department level, but you need to be able to understand how are you doing from just a financial, kind of a macro financial health perspective on each credential that you're offering. And if you're spending an enormous amount of time, to your earlier point, and money recruiting students, and you've still only gotten 20 students in this particular credential, and you're losing $500,000 a year offering that credential, you need to have a hard conversation about the viability of continuing to do that. And what we found is that to do that, we really also have to consider general education electives and major requirements together, not just the major requirements that come directly from that department. So here's a way that we might be able to look at that. This is a mock-up of a finance app in our framework where the chief business officer, the chief academic officer can kind of come together and collaborate, which is really the goal here, bringing them together in a true collaboration where they can talk objectively about the financial viability of these various different programs and the enrollment health that can lead to whether or not each credential has a positive or a negative contribution margin.
For some folks that are joining us, I always need to remind people that there's revenue minus expenses, and there needs to be something left over. We often have built some academic programs with, it breaks even, like revenue minus expenses. Well, who's going to pay for the lights? Who's going to pay for the heat? Who's going to pay for the, the shovels? All the things that we need to do.
Absolutely.
The institution has to have margin. Every program has to have margin.
Absolutely.
And that's probably the place where we get pushback, and then we know the business officer gets the pushback the most, is understanding that margin. We know it's different, and that's why we need to have some high margin programs with some lower margin programs to have that overall fiscal health. But critical for everyone that's joining us today, know that this is an essential foundational element that we have to live with.
Yeah, good point. I mean, if in the macro sense, if the gross margin coming out of academics is a break even, the institution is bleeding massively financially.
Exactly.
So, we can also look at things like a break even analysis. You mentioned, Jim, that, that each credential, depending on the expense of teaching that class, the physical space, some of those kinds of things. If we want to get into some of the indirect costs as well, that this is another even more detailed analysis that we can take to look at break even with some assumptions, right? That doesn't mean that you can take those 50 students or 25 students or whatever the break even is and fragment them by time of day, campus, modality, all those things. It means if they're all in one cohort, what's the break even?
That's why following the student is so important.
Yes, exactly. So again, the things that just kind of as an overview, looking at the whole academic enterprise framework, this is kind of for our folks on the academic side of the house in the registrar's office. What we've discovered over these 25 years of doing this is that financial health really is the result of both good planning and effective data-informed scheduling. And so that's really what the academic enterprise is about. We want to be able to make sure that financial health is there, but ultimately we need to be doing that to support student success. You know, and then a couple of other little graphics, because these are newer solutions for Ad Astra. You know, we've come up with a I think a really cool framework for measuring and understanding financial or enrollment health of a credential. So how many students do we have? How long is it taking them to complete those credentials? How are those enrollments fragmented by location or modality? And then we can get a handle on how many students should we expect in any level of progress in a pathway. And that really allows us to then measure pathway health, where we can see, okay, is that enrollment getting further fragmented, like in this particular case, where instead of having one healthy course or moderately healthy course, the institution has decided to offer two choices to meet this degree requirement, and has basically created two unhealthy courses in the process. So just transparency into those kinds of decisions. And then what I think most of our folks are most familiar with Ad Astra at least, is this notion of schedule refinement, where ultimately, hopefully all of these things are working together, where we're understanding financial health, we're understanding enrollment health, we're managing our pathways, and then we're creating kind of a set of guardrails almost, to where when we're scheduling, we know the plan, we know how to execute the plan. And if we're starting to kind of come up against the guardrails and doing things that are going to compromise our financial health, we'll know that right here in the schedule refinement process.
This is exactly the beauty of these analytic tools that more business officers are leaning into, wanting to understand better, and wanting others on campus to really understand these as well, so that in that portfolio concept and the ways of trying to create more sustainable futures, you're using these types of tools to really be successful.
Yeah, and that's our goal. And you know, we're really excited about partnering with Jim and his group at NACUBO Consulting. And again, these are very lightweight engagements where Jim and his team can come in and kind of get the lay of the land, and really be a complementary piece to the strategy that weaves together both the finance and the academics in a collaborative discussion. So with that, we're really open for discussion. Jim, I greatly appreciate your time and your partnership with Ad Astra, and we're looking forward to having a robust conversation with the group.
Great, let's get started.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.